moving in a way that looked like speech. Up close her face had that wind-creased plainness Jonna had come to rely upon. She brushed an errant line of rope off her sleeve, and looked at him with a frankness that had no patience for self-pity. "You look cold," she said. He told her, in a voice that was thin as it always felt when he talked of anything about himself, that he had misplaced something. "My shadow's gone," he said finally, because to say it in a simple line made the fact less like the collapse of an inner castle. Mara cocked her head as if he had spoken a riddle. "You mean you can't feel your feet?" He almost laughed. He had been trying not to do anything dramatic. "No, my shadow. It should be there against the cobbles. It isn't." There was a short silence while she knotted the rope tighter. "Come along then. Well, look. Or do you want bread first?" She offered the practical choice as if it were a kindness and not a committee of worry. He took the bread. At the stall they ate in the open air with the fog pressing in. Mara spoke about small things. Captain Liz grumbling about a broken crate, a child who had sold his whistle to buy lamp oil. Jonna answered in small ways, the ledger occupying the space of many of his replies like a quiet thing he was reluctant to expose. He thought about telling her about the scraped line in the ledger but stopped himself. The ledger's secrecy felt like an oath he had made to every person whose trades it recorded. Old Tilda's door was open later, though the hour allowed no visitors in any considered way. She sat with a mug of something steaming and watched Jonna as if he were an animal at a distance. Her shop smelled of wax, dried herbs, and a particular kind of dust that felt like memory. He set the ledger on her table without much ceremony. She did not touch it at once. She poured him a share of tea and waited until his hands had been warmed by the cup. "You look thinner," she said. She always spoke like that, small, observant sentences that felt like tests. Jonna shrugged and pushed the ledger toward her. She opened it slowly, eyes moving down the neat columns. She did not make the face of astonishment some strangers might have at seeing his careful work. Instead, there was a small, almost maternal frown. "There are erasures," she said. Her fingers hovered above the scraped crescent. Her thumb left a faint smear on the margin where a fine powder of dust had lodged. Not many could do that without tearing the page. Jonna felt the ground of his small certainties shift. Could someone take a shadow? He asked the question aloud, as if naming the possibility might make it less terrible. Tilda looked at him for a long moment. People do things with shadows now that they once would not have considered. Some people collect. Some people tidy. Some people think they are saving others. It is all the same work when you notice the pattern. She paused. "There was a trade I did not make once. A young woman came to me with a shadow like a bird flight in the angle of it. I refused and kept her shadow in the house, and she left with it. I thought I had done the right thing. Later I watched her carry that flight inside her like a grief. It changed me. I regret the refusal often. If a hand takes a shadow from another, they have the power to make that choice for them." She turned the ledger to him gently. "You cannot be certain yet where yours has gone. But keep this carefully. You write like someone who thinks paper will not forget. Paper forgets differently. Paper is kind, but paper needs protectors." Her way with words was not the rhetoric he expected. It did not give him a plan. It gave him instead an allowance to be frightened and to proceed. He left old Tilda with the ledger folded beneath his coat and a small sting in his chest. What he did next was the slow, local work of trying to account. He went to the few people whose shadows he had last handled. His procedure was the same approach with small words: watch, ask if anything felt odd. Some people laughed off the thought. Mrs. Holm took his concern as if it was a sort of joke and offered him tea. Thomas Reed squinted and said a thing that was rare for him. He sounded confused when Jonna asked about memory of a particular kindness. "Maybe I don't remember that night as he did," Thomas said finally. "Maybe I do. I don't know." The uncertainty in a man with broad palms deepened Jonna's sense of culpability. He found himself, by dusk, moving in the edges where Elias's business had become a rumor. He peered at the back of a shop, where a man moved behind a curtained doorway. He noticed Gideon Pry moving too, a careful figure with a parcel. In a market stall, someone sold a jar with a fine label and then, when Jonah asked a question, snapped the window shut for no reason that matched politeness. Jonah did not know what to make of these small evasions. They accumulated into suspicion like small coins dropping into a jar. That night he sat with the ledger on his lap and tried to make a list that would be useful. He wrote, check Elias. Ask Faye. Revisit erased entry. Reread ledger from month of storm. The last item felt like returning to the beginning, to the place where he had first learned that shadows could be handled and where his method of softening regret had been forged. The paper on which he wrote bowed slightly from the damp. His fingers left faint rings of salt. He slept badly and woke to the same absence. When he moved about during the small hours, he found he had become more attentive to other people's responses to the weather and to light. He noted with a slow, accumulating ache, the ways certain trades had changed the town, sometimes gently, sometimes in ways that left raggedness. The ledger's erased line pressed under his skin like an itch he could not scratch. He imagined someone who organized and cared for such things shelving his shadow carefully among others, labeling it, perhaps, with a clinical hand. He imagined what misreadings they might make of it without the person it belonged to. The thought of people interpreting his regret as a specimen made him feel smaller than he had imagined being. It was not merely professional anxiety that gnawed at him. There was a private ache that had less to do with trade than with identity. The shadow had been a thing that told him who he was, when he could not name the feeling inside his chest. It had been a companion that answered his solitude in a manner he had never fully admitted to. To lose it felt like losing the ability to define himself tangibly in the town's dark. He had been the one to gather other people's truths, to make them lighter. Now he was unmoored from the apparatus he used to do it, and the ledger's rasping edge felt suddenly like a missing map. By evening he had decided to begin in ways that were both practical and small. He would ask Faye, quietly, from a place of more fact than accusation. He would try to read Gideon's face when he happened to see him. He would return to old Tilda and to Mara for small comforts. He would not yet go to Elias. He felt the honesty of waiting, of not leaping to a choice that might take another's weight on him as a quick solution. If there was a way to reclaim his shadow by any method that did not force a pain onto another, he would find it. Or at least he would try in ways that left the moral arithmetic visible. That night, as he closed the ledger and set the lamp to a low wick, Jonah tried to measure the horizon in small things. The town hummed around him with the ordinary business of forgetting and remembering. A cart creaked by, and two voices argued about the price of herring. Somewhere down the quay a dog barked at nothing and then settled. Jonah stood by the window, watching the lamplight on the wet street, and placed the ledger beside his bed like talisman and warning both. He listened for the shadow, as one might listen for someone's breath in an adjoining room. There was no sign. He resolved, with the peculiar firmness of someone who has lost something and refuses to let it stay missing without answer, to begin his search the next morning with the ledger in his coat and Mara at his side if she could be. He did not yet know whether he would seek containment, find the place where collections were kept, and take what belonged to him back, or whether he would find a way to call a town meeting to compel disclosure. The options were a map with many unnamed paths. Outside, a bell tolled from the harbor like a punctuation. Jonah turned the lamp down until it pooled like a soft wound and lay awake thinking of the scraped line of ink in the ledger. He imagined his shadow shelved in a room lit by someone else's lamp, and the image felt like a breach. He resigned himself, finally, to the fact that the work he had done for years had shaped a small economy of forgetting in which he, too, could be entangled. He would have to go into the places he had only ever visited as a careful collector, and learn what it meant to be the person who had lost something. The chapter closes as Jonah falls into a sleep that is half plan and half fear. In the last light before he sleeps, he thinks he hears a soft scrape at a distance, the kind of sound a hand makes when it edges along a shelf, looking for the right jar. He holds very still, listening, but either the sound was only his mind or else it was the sound of a town that was busied, at night, with its small, dangerous habits. The thought lingers like a thread. If someone else was taking shadows cleanly and cataloging them with their own tidy ethics, then the discrepancy in his ledger and the absence by his window were not accidents. They were beginnings. Jonah does not yet know whether he will find his shadow arranged like an artifact, or whether he will discover something worse. But the certainty that he must look is now a quiet, inexorable weight. He sleeps with the ledger at his side and wakes to a morning when the fog seems a degree thicker. He pulls on his coat, tucks the ledger inside, and steps into the quay knowing that the ordinary work of the town haggling, mending, mourning now intersects with a personal hunt. The first steps of the search are small and precise: ask, read, watch. He sets his jaw and moves away from the lamp and toward the places where shadows are spoken for as if they were trade goods. A gull arcs low and leaves a clean mark on the air. Jonah feels the line of things he has done and the line of things done for him meet and cross. He does not yet have the answer. The hole where the shadow should be remains open, a domestic wound. He walks into the fog anyway, holding the ledger as both map and accusation, and the town folds quietly around him. Unaware how one small absence will come to rearrange the life it had come to rely upon him to steady, the fog had a way of making the town feel smaller and more secretive, as if alleys were folds in a single, soft cloth that could be smoothed and recreased at any hour. Jonah moved among these folds with the careful deliberation of one who had learned to read the town's silences, a pause at a doorway, the way a shoe scuffed a threshold, the sudden absence of conversation where gossip usually lived. Tonight, the fog clung in layers, and the lamplight weak, yellow, and damp left hollows that made the cobbles look like the skin of an old map. He walked with his ledger under his arm, tucked close beneath his jacket, as if the pages themselves might be blown away by a gust of salt. The handwriting inside was his hand, though some entries had been made with the hurried scrawl of other hands, clients leaving notes. Old Tilda adding a margin comment in ink that looked older than the paper. Jonah flipped to the pages that mattered, fingers finding familiar stains where rain or salt or soot had seeped in. He had carried this book for months. It was an extension of his own nervous apparatus. To lose an entry was to lose a compass point. To find an irregularity was to feel an old map tearing at one corner. He stood for a long moment under a lamp post by an alley that led from the market to the older warehouses. The light painted the wet cobbles in a warm blur. Puddles held not only clouds but truncated memories of eaves and chimneys. His boots made no discernible shadow where light met stone. He felt it as a coolness along the soles, a space of absent dark that didn't quite belong to him. In the small ledger he kept careful notes for tonight, names he wanted to check, addresses where trades had been recorded, dates he needed to verify. At the top of one page, in his neat hand, was the name Mallory House, April, softened laugh, trade sealed with lamp and promise. He had written it after the trade itself had seemed to work. The woman upstairs had stopped waking with a jolt at midnight, and her son had come downstairs the next morning to meet visitors with a steadier face. But when Jonah pressed the book flat with his thumb and turned the page, something in the margin didn't feel right. A line that should have contained the notation of the ledger number had always stamped outwardly, with the small seal Tilda had given him, was faint, as if washed, or never written. He had to be precise. He could not afford to be anxious and casual in the same breath. Jonah's method was small and patient. He walked from doorway to doorway, tapping on lintel wood and listening. The town answers differently to the hand that knocks gently. At a narrow stair, a woman opened without looking at him. Her eyes swam in the glance of the lamplight returning. She had the sort of voice that started mid-thought and folded in on itself again when a phrase reached a place she should recognize and did. "Evening," she said. She hummed a few bars of something thin, a tune like a memory of a song rather than the song itself. "Do you want it back?" Back? Jonah asked before he could find a smooth sentence. He had not expected the question, though in some corner of his mind it had been waiting. "My laugh," she said. There's a sound I remember making when the laundry dried in summer. My daughter used to laugh and it fit me like a glove, and now I can't place it." Jonah thought of the ledger. He thought of the entry that read Mallory House, and then the faint margin where the seal number should have been. The ledger had been a promise, a contract of clarity between him and those he helped. It had been a way to mark what had gone out and what had been given. But the black hole at the edge of the page pulled at him with a gravity that felt like accusation. Do people miss important parts when you bother them?" The woman asked, not unkindly. "Sometimes I don't know whether it's better to sleep and not remember the things that pinch. It's quieter." Jonah listened to the softness of the sentence and internalized its willingness to resign. He told her, carefully, what he had been telling himself for weeks, that some things, once moved, did not fit back in neatly. He did not tell her the ledger's margins had been rearranged. He left with a polite nod and a pocket of bread Mara had brought him that day, grateful for the small crust he had not expected. He kept walking until he found the market where the fish were hung like damp flags and the stallholders shouted at one another through the fog as if to prove that heat still existed in a place where the sky felt indifferent. Jonah made his way to where the lines of rope bridges shuddered gently with each cart that passed. He had been told to check on Thomas Reed. Jonah had traded with Thomas months before, although the entry had seemed routine. Thomas had come to him with a nod of regret about a missed kindness, a day when, in the middle of a shipment, had turned his back on a boy asking for help. Jonah had offered Thomas a shadow that would take the repeated sting away, not to erase the fact that had turned away, but to stop the image from unreeling in his mind so often it made him brittle. Thomas was there at the stalls, sleeves rolled, the salt air drying fish sheen from his forearms. He held a net in one huge hand like a child's kite string. "Evening, Thomas," Jonah said, and for a second the name felt like a small, clean coin. Thomas looked up. The face Jonah loved to consider as a proof broad, rough-hewn had a new slackness. He was doing the work, but he did it as if his hands belonged to someone he no longer recognized. He looked down at Jonah when Jonah came close, and the look stayed too long on the ledger Jonah held. "You looking for business?" Thomas asked. "No," Jonah said. "I was just checking. I thought I could ask how it's been. The thing we traded, is it?" Thomas blinked slow. For a second Jonah thought he had misjudged him. Then Thomas laughed, a sound that hit the damp rope above and made gulls shriek. "I can do the work," he said. "I can lift the crates. The lads notice I don't get caught in my head as much. That's the thing with the trade. I don't think about the boy as often. But sometimes, at night, I try to picture his face and I can't get the shape of his nose right. It's like I have the memory of doing wrong without the person I wronged. It's an itch without an edge." Jonah felt his stomach drop, as if someone had tightened a rope around it. That was not what he'd promised Thomas. He had thought to relieve the repeated beating of guilt, so the man might sleep. He had not fully considered that memory's contour had been serving as a brace for other small things: detail, patience, the habit of noticing. Tom's inability to reconstruct the boy's nose was not a triviality. It was a gap where narrative once anchored consequence. Jonah's hands went to the ledger automatically. He turned to the page with Thomas' name, looking for his own careful notation. Thomas Reed May softened recurrence. Lamp for night, coin. He found the entry neat, a little smudged where he had rested his thumb. The margin still held the seal number he'd used. But in the days since, Jonah had noticed other names whose ledger lines had not been whole, smudged margins, faint digits, entries where only partial dates remained. He looked up. Thomas' gaze had gone somewhere else, past the bridge, where a small boy ran and fell into the shallow edge of the quay and came up laughing. Thomas did not look at the boy as a threat or a memory. It was as if the event could be sterilized of its moral weight. Do you regret it at all?" Jonah asked, hesitant. Thomas shrugged. "Not like before," he said. "But that doesn't mean I don't feel blank sometimes, like a missing bead on a string. The phrase lodged with Jonah. He thought of necklaces with a missing bead, of threads that, when slackened in a small place, could cause other pieces to slide. He realized he had, in trying to make people lighter, loosened the very scaffolding that held them upright. He moved on, ledger growing heavier in his thoughts. The fog seemed to press closer, making the quay look like a shallow mouth. He walked toward the older warehouses, where Elias Ven's name clung to the lips of certain people, said in a low and careful tone, as if his name would set off a chime bell. He had not planned to go there. This was the sort of route curiosity took when it became compulsion. Jonah's mind was full of entries he wished he could cross-reference, dates, times of day, the names of lamps left on at night. He found old Tilda by accident, or perhaps by a kind of gravitational inevitability. Her shop was smaller than he remembered, and seemed to have lost a shelf, but gained another, as if time itself had rearranged her belongings by a vote. The smell inside was tea and brine, and something redolent of iron, perhaps a memory Tilda kept for herself. She was sitting by the window, a small cup in her hands. The window caught the light from a lamp outside, and turned them both into a silhouette, with a map of ragged cities, bleeding across the glass. "You look like a boy who has been carrying more than bread," Tilda said, not unkindly. The edges of her words felt like small stones. "I am checking things," Jonah said. He sat opposite her, laying the ledger between them like an offering. "I have been rechecking trades. I need to know if Tilda's hands did not tremble but her eyes narrowed. If the ledger is whole, then you will find the ledger speaks with a single voice. If the ledger has been rewritten, then you are not merely a broker of consolation. You are part of a story written over." Jonah felt the sentence fold around him. He pushed the ledger toward her. Tilda's fingers moved like a woman threading beads, deliberate, familiar. She opened to a page and read. Jonah watched her eyes for any sign of the small flinch he associated with being caught in an untruth. There was no theatricality in Tilda. She did not sing accusations. Instead, she looked with the clarity of someone who had once performed a birth, and had seen the thin line between beginning and pain. "You have a clean hand in certain entries and not in others," she said finally. "You keep your seals consistent. But some margins are faint. Some numbers have been bored with a needle. Someone has tried to make the ledger seem whole while removing the edges." "Who would do that?" Jonah asked. The question was small and sterile, but when he said it he heard a loud and foolish hope in his voice that someone else had been careless enough to make a mistake he could fix. "Those who do not like messes," Tilda said. "Those who believe they can tidy memory into boxes with labels and tell themselves the world is safe." "You mean Elias," Jonah said, even though he wanted to say Elias' name like a plea. "He has people." He has Tilda's mouth made a line. "Elias cleans differently," she said. "He wants to order things, to catalog, to keep the worst things in jars they cannot pour out. He thinks preservation will prevent drowning. But preservation is an act of possession." Jonah's throat tightened. "But why the ledger? Why go through my pages?" "Because your ledger is a map of didactic kindness," Tilda said. "It is the proof that someone here confessed their regret and asked for relief. To take those particular entries is to reshape the town's conscience into something manageable. To move your hands is to move the town's history." There was a long silence. Jonah watched Tilda's face, reading the fine lines like little topographies. He thought of the lamplight and the woman who could not place her daughter's laugh. He thought of Thomas' missing bead. He thought of his own feet and the way the absence of shadow had made everything else feel sharp. "What do I do?" Jonah asked. Tilda looked at him and, for the first time in months, Jonah felt like a boy who could be spoken to directly. "You ask who holds the ledger instead of a ledger held by a conscience," she said. "You follow the margins. Be very careful about what you want to find. Answers are sticky. They will make you ask whether comfort was worth its cost." Jonah folded the book and stepped back into the alley, Tilda's words echoing like a bell. Mara found him halfway down the lane, carrying a basket with a salted fish wrapped in cloth and a flask of something warm. She did not ask about the ledger at first. She pressed the flask into his hand, and watched him like someone measuring a tide. "You look like you have been at someone else's funeral," she said, straightforward as ever. "It's the ledger," Jonna said. "Some lines are missing, or altered." "People I helped." Mara's face tightened in a way that made her seem older than her years. "We thought you were making things livable," she said. "You kept people's nights from folding them in half. If someone is taking parts from you, that's not like mercy. That's like theft." They walked together along the quayside. Jonna told Mara about Thomas and the woman who couldn't place her daughter's laugh. He told her about Tilda's reading and about his constant, quiet cold where shadow should have been. Mara listened, sometimes huffing softly as if to blow away the fog at her feet. When he finished, she made a practical suggestion, blunt and immediate as always. "We should go to the warehouses," she said. "You can't trundle through everything alone. I'll ask a friend of mine at the docks for a lookout. If there's a place where someone keeps things, someone will notice us nosing about. And we can't stand about with your ledger. People will see you with it. We need cover and a plan." Jonna thought of Ilias' name again, how people said it the way one says a bad weather forecast. He did not want to call Elias evil. Tilda had warned him against too simple a judgment. But he felt, for the first time, something like a moral arithmetic taking form. Where the ledger had holes, there were likely rooms filled with small, precise darknesses, catalogued and labeled, as if grief could be boxed and arranged like spices. By the time they reached the row of warehouses, the fog had begun to thin toward the water, revealing the outline of stacked crates and a few lights stubbornly on. Jonna tucked the ledger into his coat and tried to think like someone who might break a habit rather than the law. Mara kept her voice low and steady. Her fingers were sure on the rope she coiled and passed. There was a rhythm to their approach. Move quietly, ask calmly, note the names of men who looked too clean to be dock workers. An old man on the quay, a man who had once helped Jonna lift a crate when he was small, saw them and shifted his stance. Jonna felt like the bay itself had turned and was watching. He could not quite tell whether the world was holding its breath or simply waiting its turn. They did not find Elias that night. What they found instead were smaller pieces, a tag on a crate, with a hand he recognized in the curvature of its letters. A scrap of paper, folded and hidden under a nail, bearing a ledger number that matched one of the faint margins in Jonna's book. The distant, faint sound of someone humming a cataloging song in a tongue that tried not to be human. Jonna had the ledger at his chest as if it were a heart. He pressed the found scrap into the book and felt, in that private action, a tiny and terrible affirmation. Something had been taken, and the seams of small lives had been opened. Where the fog thinned and the light caught the edge of the sea, Jonna realized the work ahead had shifted from making amends in slow trades to tracing theft. That was a different undertaking altogether, one that might require deception of a kind he had scarcely permitted himself before. They left the quay with the scrap folded into Jonna's palm. It felt like holding a coin that might fit only one slot in a machine. As they walked, Jonna thought of the woman who could no longer place her daughter's laugh. He thought of Thomas and the missing bead on his string. He thought of old Tilda's quiet admonishment, "Be careful about what you want to find." When they reached the rope bridge, Jonna paused. The bridge swayed slightly in the night breeze, and the lamplight made the ropes look like veins. He had the sudden and childish thought that if he walked too far tonight he might never find his way back. Mara's hand on the sleeve of his coat was a small, steadying thing. "What will you do if you find more?" she asked. Jonna did not answer for a long while. The ledger in his jacket felt heavy with the weight of the people inside it. "I don't know," he said at last. "I think I have to know what was taken. I think I have to know whether what I gave away was supposed to be kept or held. And if it's true that someone is taking pieces to keep them whole for themselves, then I need to stop them." Mara's mouth made a line. "And if they don't want to be stopped?" Then Jonna said something that surprised even him. "Then we make them want to stop." They did not know how to be a hammer that night. They only knew how to be people who would press fingers to paper and promise themselves to the slow